room went quiet when she walked in, and not the kind of quiet that comes from respect. It was the other kind. The kind where people stop their conversations mid-sentence, exchange a look, and then resume talking just slightly louder than before, as if to prove the interruption meant nothing, as if she meant nothing. Sergeant First Class Dara Wynne had walked into rooms like that before. She would walk into rooms like that again. She had learned, somewhere around her third deployment, that the silence itself wasn't the problem. It was what people decided to do after it. Most of them decided to wait. The FOB sat at the edge of a valley in eastern Afghanistan that didn't have a name on most maps, just a grid coordinate that the battalion had taken to calling Red Line because of the colors someone had used to circle it during a planning session 6 months earlier. The circle had been intended to indicate a danger zone. Nobody thought to change the name after the FOB went up. It was October. The cold came early in that part of the country, sliding down from the mountains before anyone was ready for it, and the soldiers on Red Line had not been issued the cold weather gear they'd requisitioned in August. They moved around the FOB in layers of whatever they had. Some of them looked almost civilian in their improvised arrangements of fleece and borrowed jackets. Wynne did not. She wore her kit the way she always wore it, adjusted to exactly the position she needed. Nothing extraneous, nothing missing. People who noticed things noticed this about her before they noticed anything else. The team she was being attached to had been briefed about her arrival the night before, or some of them had. The briefing had been incomplete, which was sometimes deliberate and sometimes wasn't, and in this case nobody could have said which it was. What the team knew, a new asset was being attached for the duration of the Corda operation. ISR qualified. Certified on the platform they'd be using in the valley. Available immediately. What the briefing had not specified, the asset's name, the asset's rank, the asset's gender. Staff Sergeant Pryor found out in the same moment everyone else did. When Wynne came through the door of the planning room with her bag over one shoulder and her tablet under her arm, and the room went quiet, and Pryor looked at her for 2 full seconds before he said, to no one in particular, "Huh." It was a very specific kind of huh. It contained several things. Surprise, yes, but also a kind of amused skepticism that Wynne had learned to read the way a meteorologist reads a pressure system, as a sign of what was coming. What was coming in Pryor's case was not hostility. Not exactly. It was something more like a settled certainty that a mistake had been made somewhere up the chain, and that the mistake would sort itself out soon enough, and that in the meantime, there was no point getting worked up about it. He introduced himself. He introduced the others. He spelled out her bunk assignment and the time for the first planning session and asked if she needed anything. She said she didn't. He nodded, satisfied with this, and went back to his map. What Wynne noticed, and she noticed it the way she noticed everything, without reaction, filing it away, was that he had introduced her to the team the way someone introduces a temporary inconvenience, not an asset, not a colleague, a placeholder that would, in time, be replaced by whatever they'd originally ordered. She had been a placeholder before. She knew what to do with it. The Corda operation had been in development for 11 weeks. It had gone through 4 different iterations, 2 different teams, and 1 significant restructuring after the original tactical approach was assessed as unworkable by someone at a level above the people who designed it. The current version had a cleaner objective and a tighter timeline and a single complicating factor that no one had been able to fully resolve. The valley had a ridge. The ridge sat at an elevation of approximately 9,000 feet on the eastern side. And whatever they were going to do in the valley, they were going to do it with eyes on that ridge, because the ridge had eyes on them. 3 separate surveillance passes had confirmed a presence up there. Not a fixed installation, nothing sophisticated, but a rotating element that moved in patterns that suggested intelligence collection rather than direct threat. Someone on that ridge was watching the valley. The question of who, and more importantly why, had not been answered. The original team had planned to address the ridge problem with air assets. The restructured team had inherited this approach, looked at it, and identified 2 problems. First, the air assets weren't available during the window. Second, even if they were, using them would announce the operation before it was in position. The solution was a ground element, someone who could move up the eastern face, get eyes on the ridge position, assess what was there, and either eliminate it or call it in depending on what they found. This was why Wynne was here. She had done this before. 3 times, actually, on 2 different deployments, on different terrain, in different conditions, and the records of what she'd done existed in a system that Pryor had access to and had not yet reviewed. He would review it later that night, after the first planning session, sitting on the edge of his cot with a headlamp and the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he'd already understood. But that was later. First, there was the planning session. The planning session lasted 3 hours. Wynne sat at the far end of the table with her tablet and did not speak unless directly addressed, which happened twice. Both times she answered precisely and then stopped talking. Both times, Pryor watched her for a moment after she finished, the way you watch a door after someone walks through it. After the session, a man named Eckhart found her at the edge of the fob where the barrier wire ran along the eastern perimeter, and he leaned against the HESCO next to her and looked out at the same darkness she was looking at. "You qualified on the 72, he asked. She said she was. Did Pryor look at your record yet? She said she didn't know. He hasn't, Eckhart said. I could tell by the way he was looking at you. She didn't respond to that. I'm not saying it's a problem, Eckhart said. I'm just saying, give it tonight. He'll look it over, and in the morning he'll be different. I'm not waiting for him to be different, Wynne said. Eckhart considered that. Fair enough, he said, and left. She stayed at the wire for another 20 minutes, looking at the shape of the ridge against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky, and tried to calculate, from this distance and this angle, where the observation post would be. She had a guess. She kept it to herself. The cold got worse before the operation launched. 2 soldiers at the FOB went down with respiratory infections that spread through 3 bunk rooms before anyone identified what was happening. And the medical officer spent 4 days managing it, and the atmosphere on Redline took on the particular quality of a place where people are tired and uncomfortable and trying not to admit either. Wynne stayed healthy. She ran every morning at 0500 before the rest of the team was moving, up and down the perimeter road in the dark, and she ate the hot food when it was available and the cold food when it wasn't, and she slept when she could. She had done enough deployments to understand that the body was an asset like any other, and that assets required maintenance. Pryor had, in fact, reviewed her record. He didn't say so directly, but on the second day, he started including her in conversations he'd previously been conducting without her, and he stopped performing that slight pause before her name. The pause that said, I'm about to address the placeholder, and started speaking to her with the brisk efficiency he used with the rest of the team. It wasn't warmth, but it was something. The rest of the team took slightly longer. Kellner, who was 23 and had been in country for 4 months, seemed constitutionally unable to look at her directly. He would answer questions she asked him, while facing slightly to the left, addressing her in the direction of a point about 18 inches from her ear. Wynne found this more interesting than offensive. She'd noticed it in young men before, this particular form of not quite knowing where to look, and she had developed a working theory that it was related to how they'd been trained to think about female presence in a combat context, not as something to dismiss or accept, but as something their training hadn't given them adequate tools to categorize. So, they split the difference by not quite looking. She didn't push it. She gave Kellner space and waited. The team's senior NCO, a man named Ferris, whose last name was the only thing she ever heard him called, moved around the uncertainty differently. He seemed to have decided, very early, that the question of how to think about Wynne was a question he was not required to answer before the operation. He treated her the way he treated the equipment, reliably, without ceremony, focused on function. She respected him for it. The operation launched on the 6th day. The main element was moving at 0200, which meant the ground portion of Wynne's work needed to begin at 2000 the previous evening. She would have 10 hours on the eastern face, enough time to move up in darkness, establish position before dawn, observe through the light period, and either resolve the ridge problem or transmit a clear picture of what was there before the main element was in the valley. She moved alone. This had been a point of discussion during planning. Pryor had initially proposed sending Kellner with her, as much for communications redundancy as anything else. But Wynne had explained, with a flatness that ended the conversation, that a 2-person movement up an observed slope in the dark was twice the noise and twice the silhouette with a marginal communications benefit, and that she had done solo reconnaissance in worse conditions and on more complicated terrain, and that if Pryor wanted Kellner on the eastern face for a reason other than redundancy, She needed to hear the reason. Pryor had not offered a reason. Kellner went with the main element. She moved out through the eastern wire at 2003. The guard on that post, a young specialist named O.C. Bonsu, who had been stationed there through some administrative lottery that nobody was happy about, watched her go and then looked away and then looked back and then watched her disappear into the dark and said nothing to anyone about the particular quality of that disappearance, the silence of it, the economy of motion, the way she just became part of the dark instead of moving through it. He thought about it later. For a long time, actually. The eastern face was not as steep as the map suggested, but it was loose in ways the maps couldn't capture. The kind of terrain that gives underfoot in unexpected places, where a step that seems solid generates a small cascade of rock that you can hear farther than you'd like. Wynne had read the topography reports and made her own adjustments. She moved on the northern shoulder of the ridge, where the rock was older and more consolidated, and she moved slowly enough that the sounds she made were absorbed by the ambient noise of the wind off the mountain. She reached the first waypoint at 22:47 and paused for 17 minutes to listen. The ridge held the particular silence of a place that has its own sounds: wind, settling rock, something biological in the brush to the northeast that she categorized as non-human without having to think hard about it. No fires, no voices, no smell of cooking or fuel. She moved again. The observation post, when she found it, was not where she had guessed from the wire. It was 50 meters east of her estimate, tucked into a natural formation that the aerial photography hadn't adequately captured because of the angle of the imagery. She understood, seeing it, why 4 different analysts had failed to correctly place it. The formation created a shadow effect that made the hollow beneath it invisible from above. She had found it from below because she had been looking with the right question. Not where would someone put a post here, but where would I put a post here? The answer had been obvious once she framed it that way. There were 2 of them. She assessed this from the body heat distribution, the ambient sound signature, and a single moment of low voice she caught at 011 time. Words she couldn't make out, but a cadence she recognized as conversation rather than communication, which told her they were bored and had been here long enough to get comfortable. Comfortable was a vulnerability. She transmitted a position report at 0134. Then she settled in and waited for the light. At 0341, something changed. She didn't hear it first. She felt it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. A shift in the quality of the cold, a different movement in the brush along the slope below her. She had been in position long enough that her awareness had calibrated to the baseline of the terrain, and what she was feeling now was a deviation from that baseline. She didn't move. She slowed her breathing and repositioned her weight across 3 points instead of 2, and kept her eyes moving in the pattern she'd trained herself to use in low light, not looking directly at anything, but building a picture from the peripheral. The movement resolved eventually into a single figure coming up the slope from the southeast. Not toward her, toward the observation post. A third person. She transmitted again, 1 word. Then she watched. What happened next took 11 minutes. It involved a change in the configuration of the post that significantly altered the calculus of the Corda operation below. She documented it, transmitted it, and received back a sequence of acknowledgments that told her the information was reaching the right people. The main element adjusted. She knew this from the communications she was monitoring. She didn't know the details of the adjustment. She didn't need to. She stayed on the ridge until 0718, when the main element called the valley clean and she received the signal to extract. She moved back down the northern shoulder in the early light, picking her way across the loose section with the same patience she'd used going up, and she was through the eastern wire by 0847. O.C. Bonsu was not on the gate anymore. Someone named Hollis was. He looked at her for a moment when she came through, and then looked at the wire she'd come from and then back at her. "That's the eastern face," he said. "It is," she agreed, and kept walking. The debrief happened at 1100. Wynne walked through her observation report in the methodical sequence she'd been trained to use, covering position, timing, assessment, and the 0341 development in the order that would be most useful for the written record. She answered questions. She corrected 2 minor misunderstandings about the geography of the hollow where the post had been. Pryor listened with the expression of someone revising a calculation he'd been running for several days. Ferris listened the way Ferris always listened, with complete attention and no visible reaction. Kellner was in the corner, and somewhere during the debrief, he stopped performing the 18-inch offset and just looked at her directly without appearing to notice he'd done it. The person who asked the most questions was a man Wynne hadn't met before, introduced only as Commander Drell, who had come out from the headquarters element the previous night and had been in the valley with the main element for the operation. He was lean and somewhere past 50 and had the particular stillness of someone who had been in a very large number of rooms and knew how to measure the quality of what was being said to him. He asked about the shadow effect in the hollow. He asked about her route selection on the northern shoulder. He asked about the 0341 transmission and the reasoning she'd used to assess the movement as a third person, rather than one of the two repositioning. She answered all of it. At the end, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That assessment at 0341 changed the operation." She acknowledged this. "Without it," he said, "we'd have had a serious problem in the second phase." She said she understood. He looked at her for a moment in the way that people look when they are deciding whether to say something. Then he said, "The northern shoulder approach. You developed that on your own? It wasn't in the plan?" "No," she said. "It wasn't in the plan. What made you go that way?" She thought about how to say it. "The plan was based on the imagery. The imagery had a limitation. I was working from ground level, so I had different information." Commander Drell nodded slowly. "That's what made the difference. The room had the quality it sometimes gets when something true has been said out loud that people already knew but hadn't put into words yet." Pryor was looking at the table. Ferris was looking at Wynne. Kellner was looking at the same place Wynne was looking, which was at Drell. Then Drell stood up, and the room adjusted to accommodate this, people shifting in their chairs, and he turned to face Wynne. And in the particular economy of the military, where gesture carries the weight of a great deal of language, he came to attention, and he rendered a salute that was precise and unhurried and held for a beat longer than protocol required. Wynne came to attention and returned it. The room was very quiet. Pryor sat with his hands flat on the table and did not speak. Whatever he had thought when she walked through the door 6 days ago about what she was and what she was not and what she was doing here, all of that was in the room too, but quietly, in the way of things that have been resolved without being discussed. Ferris, who had never performed anything unnecessary in the time Wynne had known him, did something that fell outside his usual economy of motion. He stood up, not for any procedural reason, just stood up. Kellner, a moment later, did the same. Wynne ate in the chow hall at 13:30. The food was the same food it always was. She sat where she always sat, with a view of the eastern wire, and she ate without hurrying, and when she was done, she sat for a few minutes with her coffee. The mountains were visible from the chow hall if you were in the right seat. She was in the right seat. She could see the eastern face, and if she knew where to look, and she did, she could almost identify the northern shoulder. She had moved along in the dark. She looked at it for a while. It did not look like much from here. It was just a slope, cold rock and loose stone, and the shadow of the hollow that you wouldn't see unless you were asking the right question. She finished her coffee. She put her tray where trays went. She had a report to file and gear to clean and 8 hours before the next briefing, and she spent none of them thinking about the salute or what it meant or what the room had looked like when Drell held it. She had been in enough rooms like that to know that thinking about them was not the point. The point was the ridge. The point was the question you had to ask to see it. She had asked it. She had climbed the slope alone in the dark, and she had asked the right question, and everything after that had followed from that, the same way everything always did. That was all it ever was. That had always been enough.